Last 2 weeks in Michigan politics, a new year means new people and priorities in the seats of power. We bring you the details on what's to come from Lansing to Capitol Hill. Plus, new leadership running for local office and coming to power in one Lakeshore County triggered years of grassroots political groundswell and oftentimes controversy. Now, as a new county board takes its seats in Ottawa County, what change they believe is to come. And former President Jimmy Carter passing away at the age of 100. How he's being remembered and how an unlikely friendship tied the 39th president to right here in Grand Rapids. I'm Josh Alburtus. It's 2025, and this is your 13 on your side rundown. We begin at the state capitol. Democrats' full control of Lansing for the first time in decades. For some, ended in disappointment as the state house adjourned in December without doing business. We sat down with top state lawmaker to recap the end of the term and more from this past year in Michigan politics.
Another year under the Capitol Dome coming to a close, but Michigan's first Democratic trifecta in roughly 4 decades not going quietly. As Republicans prepare to take control of the State House next month, some blasting what one senator described as
Democrats' lame duck dysfunction.
As the House came to a stop Thursday, the chamber not having enough lawmakers present to do their business, with House Republicans and one House Democrat being no-shows. Bills on things from voting rights to government transparency left on the House floor. And in the Senate,
we faced a choice to come back to work and to do everything we could to get good legislation to the governor's desk that was sponsored by our House colleagues who were not there for us.
So Friday afternoon, 29 hours after their Thursday session had begun, the Senate gavel rang down.
Madam President, I move that the Senate do now adjourn.
In their marathon sessions, senators working to salvage what they could. But for some, that plan amounted to ramming through unchecked bills under the cover of darkness.
It was at 6:30 in the flippin' morning. 20 and a half hours after we started this session. This should be embarrassment for every single person in here to pass these things without having them go through a committee.
But Senate Majority Leader Winnie Brink's confident in the choices made.
We did take the time to understand the policy, to ensure that it was good policy. So, more power to them. They had the constitutional right to do that. However, at the end of the day, it was really just a way to obstruct progress on things that had been already vetted.
And looking back at the last 2-year session as a whole, Brink's contrasting some of the end with what she felt were wins throughout for the people.
Tax fairness, putting more money back in the pockets of working people who just can't pay their bills, record funding for K-12 education, making sure that we were implementing policies on gun violence prevention that people had been asking for decades.
But struggling to keep a caucus together to the point that business grinds to a halt in the House could raise questions for voters come midterms as to whether Democrats should once again be trusted to control the government.
Does that complicate the message at all when you're trying to convince both your legislative partners and the voters?
I don't think so. I have confidence that we have, in a very difficult time, not just in our state, but nationally. I think even with the difficulties there, we have managed to bring wins home for the people that we serve.
And a week after we spoke with the Democratic Senate Majority Leader on the past and future, we also dove into another big question. What could Republicans be planning? We spoke with a member of the incoming Republican leadership to find out.
It's the end of another whirlwind year at the Michigan State Capitol and the end of full Democratic control under the Dome. It's a 2-year term many Democrats believe had its successes.
Tax fairness, putting more money back in the pockets of working people who just can't pay their bills, record funding for K-12 education, making sure that we were implementing policies on gun violence prevention that people had been asking for decades.
But it was also one that ended in gridlock after lawmakers were unable to do their business. with at least one House Democrat and Republican lawmakers boycotting sessions.
It became very clear in that entire process that Republicans are officially the party of the working class, working men and women of Michigan.
Many Republicans linking their absence to what they felt was a lack of progress on what they see as fixes to incoming changes to the state's minimum wage and tip credit that some say could cost many service industry workers their jobs.
The tipped wage issue will be one of the first things the House of Representatives works on and passes out of the House.
After talking with the Democratic Senate Majority Leader last week, we now sat down with incoming House Republican Floor Leader Brian Posthumus, said to have a large influence over the House agenda. We asked Posthumus about this past session and what to expect now that the State House is set to change hands. An income tax cut, a shifting energy focus, and deregulation of housing construction to combat the housing crisis and prices are all what Posthumus signaled could be possibilities.
So those are the three areas I think we need to focus on from a making Michigan more affordable standpoint.
But just as Democrats were unable to bring enough lawmakers to do business earlier this month, we asked Posthumus the same thing we asked the senator.
Does it complicate your ability to say we'll show up at the table, we'll go to work every day as elected when at the end of the session the caucus was not in the session? Do you feel that that complicates or could potentially backfire?
I don't think so at all. I mean, look, we didn't have major asks, right? We wanted to continue the conversation about tipped wages and continue the conversation about road funding without increasing taxes. I don't feel like those are stiff asks, right?
But in a new divided state government where compromise will likely be required, he believes bipartisan opportunities remain.
There are a lot of Democrats across the aisle that I have good relationships with and that I believe we will be able to work on good, solid policy and get things done for the people of Michigan. That's my hope, that's my expectation, and the people of Michigan should expect the same.
House rules say that the chamber needs to meet on the second Wednesday of each year, and in years like this, elect a speaker and a clerk and, quote, proceed with its organization. So we can expect new legislative leadership to take over this coming week on January 8th. The city of Grand Rapids says it's writing off roughly $49,000 of bills that went unpaid by the Trump campaign after two rallies in the city. Almost $33,000, we're told, was from his July rally and roughly $16,000 from his November rally, both at Van Andel Arena. The city said it's taking the losses after being, quote, unable to collect, unquote, on the invoices. We have learned Vice President Kamala Harris's campaign paid the $2,800 roughly bill up front for the rally that she held at Riverside Park in October. The city says it's now re-evaluating policies for political campaign visits. In a statement, the U.S. Secret Service said in part, quote, currently lacks, dang it. Hold on, just keep it up. I think we can still make this work. 3, 2, 1. In a statement, the U.S. Secret Service said in part it, quote, currently lacks a mechanism to reimburse local governments for their support during protective events, but went on to thank them for their contributions. In Muskegon County, Michigan Heights started the new year without a budget after a special meeting planned for the end of the year was canceled. As 13 on your side's Alexis Dumergine reported, city employees this week were continuing their work, hoping the city council would finalize the budget soon.
While the new year often brings new beginnings and well-laid plans, Muskegon Heights faces the challenges of entering 2025 without a finalized budget, which could potentially delay city workers' paychecks.
One of the other things that people will see citywide, as most people know, we're under a mandate to replace lead service lines.
This special meeting for Muskegon Heights was scheduled on December 30th, but was canceled, forcing the city of Muskegon Heights to enter the new year with questions, including questions about their budget.
We have to have a budget in place on January 1, and so council had failed to do that, so we're kind of starting the year off on some uncertain territory.
One of the primary issues with the meeting being postponed was the absence of payroll. Without an improved budget, paychecks were also unable to be processed.
Certainly the number one issue, again, I met with employees about an hour ago, the number one issue was employees getting paid from their perspective, and I understand that. And they have a commitment to work.
While there is some uncertainty there, the city workers have agreed to continue working in hopes that the city council will finalize the budget as soon as possible.
The employees have agreed to all continue to work with the assumption council's going to do this real soon.
Some of the things listed in this budget is the reconstruction of main roadways in the downtown area, including the continuation of the Broadway Avenue Road project.
Phase 2 will go from Reynolds to 5th Street. Then Phase 3 will be from 5th Street to Glade. So we expect Phase 2 to take place in 2025, and Phase 3, if we don't get in 25, will be completed in 26.
The City Council is expected to meet next Monday in hopes of finalizing their budget and starting 2025 off strong. In Muskegon Heights, I'm Alexis Dumergine, 13 on your side.
Michigan got a new U.S. Senator this week as Democrat Alyssa Slotkin was sworn in to replace now retired Senator Debbie Stabenow. It's the first time Michigan has had a new U.S. Senator sworn in a decade, and it comes after her election was decided by an incredibly tight race. Back in November, Slotkin keeping the seat in Democratic hands, defeating former Congressman Mike Rogers by less than half a percentage point, about less than 20,000 votes, with more than 5 million votes cast. Now she's on to the Senate, where news about where she's going to be could prove key to Michigan's interests and influence. Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer releasing committee assignments for where members will be. Slotkin, a former CIA analyst, was placed on the Armed Services, Veterans Affairs, and Homeland Security committees, as well as the Agriculture Committee, where her predecessor, Debbie Stabenow, had been chair in the last Congress, and it had really allowed Stabenow to build a reputation among the influential ag industry in the state. Ag was a big topic in Michigan this cycle, especially here in West Michigan. But unlike Stabenow, Slotkin did not receive the endorsement from the State Farm Bureau's Agri-PAC. Nevertheless, she said she's set to represent all of Michigan.
I have a very clear mandate from our state that elected me and elected Donald Trump to work across the aisle. For me, my job is to make sure that the small and medium-sized farmers of cherries, apples, mint, our dairies, I mean, you name it, corn, soybeans, all of our farmers don't get lost in the shuffle. And so I'm really happy to be continuing that legacy.
Being on these committees will also give Slotkin a chance to be part of confirmation hearings for some of President-elect Donald Trump's expected cabinet mix, including Pete Hegseth, his nominee to be Secretary of Defense. A hearing for Hegseth has been scheduled by Armed Services for January 14th. And to Ottawa County, where the County Commission is changing following a lot of controversy over the last 2 years. It started after the conservative group Ottawa Impact took control of the board, but after the November election this past year, a new coalition is signaling what they say is going to be change. We were at their first meeting this week.
Rallies like this and packed county commission meetings like this were a common scene in Ottawa County over the last 2 years, as it gained a new local and national reputation as a hotbed for grassroots political involvement.
The Department of Public Health is not fear-mongering.
Much of it tracing back to 2 years ago, when Republican candidates linked to the political action group Ottawa Impact gained a majority on the county commission. But now, a new commission taking the reins.
This board will make decisions based on common sense, fiscal responsibility, and we will take action for the common good.
OI's 2-year control marked by swift and sweeping moves, like changing the county motto and closing its DEI office. But it was also branded by controversy after pushback began. Some in the community protesting moves, including an early 2023 removal of the county administrator and his replacement with a former congressional candidate, as well as an effort to remove the county health officer, one of multiple legal battles for the county. But for the former chair, he believes the last 2 years were marked by positives.
In the last 2 years, we've laid a foundation for the future, starting with abolishing the DEI department and then improving processes inside the county and continuing to work for the people.
A new majority of Republicans not affiliated with Ottawa Impact taking control, electing a new chair, John Teeples, and a new vice chair. That vice chair, Josh Bruger, telling us, compared to the last 2 years and decade as a whole, change is coming.
We don't want to go back. We want to go forward. So that means some different things for different people, for us and for me, and I know for John and his heart. It means building consensus. If we can find some consensus to 8 or 9 on our votes that are contentious, I think that'll be a great success for the county.
But when we spoke with the old chair, he didn't expect much to change.
I think that we'll continue with the business of the people.
Former President Jimmy Carter passed away Sunday at the age of 100. While he held many titles, one thing that may be surprising to some was an unlikely friendship he made that gave him a close tie to West Michigan. Coming up, we take a closer look at that very unexpected friendship and how it's leading to Carter being remembered here in Grand Rapids. The nation commemorating the life and legacy of former President Jimmy Carter this week after he passed away Sunday at the age of 100. Carter held a number of different titles during his lifetime, from president to renowned humanitarian. But one thing that may surprise people was his incredibly close friendship with his predecessor, President Gerald Ford. Their friendship and Ford's roots here in Grand Rapids gave the city a special hold in Carter's heart, he once said. Now we're taking a look back on that friendship through the eyes of experts who knew it best and through what President Carter himself had to say to 13 on Your Side's Juliet Dragus a decade ago. Take a look.
Grand Rapids has a special hold on my heart because I think the finest public servant I've ever known came from Grand Rapids. Gerald Ford.
Well, first of all, it was the most improbable friendship. I don't think anyone at the end of the 76 campaign would have predicted that they would be friends, much less really very close friends, in the sense that the historical parallel is John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who late in life reconciled after having had a political falling out.
There never has been two former presidents in history, according to the historians, not just me, that were closer personal friends than Gerald Ford and me. I remember about 6 months before he passed away, I got a call from him. I got a lot of telephone calls from him, and he said, "My friend Jimmy, how you doing today?" And I said, "Fine." He said, "I want to ask a favor of you." And I said, "You can ask anything you want to, Jared, and I'll do it, I'm sure." He said, "I want you to give the eulogy at my funeral." And I was really taken aback. I didn't know what to say. And I finally said, "Okay, I'll promise to give yours if you'll give mine if I pass away first." So we had a deal. So I was very honored to come here, for his funeral and give the main eulogy. And as a matter of fact, Rosen and Betty were very close friends too. And at Betty's funeral recently, Rosen gave the eulogy in California.
President Ford and Governor Carter did not know each other prior to the 1976 presidential campaign. That was a hard-fought campaign in '76. President Ford had issued a pardon to President Nixon, his predecessor, and it really took a toll on President Ford's popularity. So he starts out the race in 1976, basically 30 points behind Governor Carter. He's got to make up 30 points. That means he's got to slug it out. He's got to draw clear distinctions with his opponent. Governor Carter, for his part, also wants to take advantage of the fact that President Ford is not particularly popular as an incumbent. But over the course of 1976, President Ford claws and scraps his way back and is able to make it a competitive race. He comes within 1 to 2 points, actually, of winning in November of '76. But in the process, of course, these candidates are drawing distinctions between each other. And when President Ford makes the mistake of saying that there's no Soviet domination of Poland, for example, in one of the debates.
There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
President Carter and his team pounced on that. Does President Ford not realize what's going on behind the Iron Curtain?
And I would like to see Mr. Ford convince the Polish Americans and the Czech Americans and the Hungarian Americans in this country that those countries don't live under the domination and supervision of the Soviet Union behind the Iron Curtain.
People forget how close the '76 election was. If 11,000 votes had changed in 2 states, Ford would have been president. But he never thought about, contesting the outcome. I'll leave it at that.
President Ford was a man of great integrity, so they match each other well in the campaign, because President Ford, even though it was considered a mistake in judgment to pardon his predecessor, President Nixon, President Ford also was not a liar. He was a man of great character. And this is going to be the basis of their later friendship. Both men have a tremendously strong character.
It's interesting. The morning after the election, Joe Garagiola, who had been staying at the White House and who had worked in the campaign with Ford. He walked into the Oval Office, burst into tears, and Ford's consoling him, and saying, listen, there are more important things, in the world than what's going to happen to Jerry Ford. And he said something very revealing. He said, without naming Carter, he said, I've got to turn the White House over to him in better shape than I found it.
I think the tone for reconciliation of these two men, these two fierce competitors, occurred already at the inaugural address that Jimmy Carter gave on January 20th, 1977. Because now newly elected and sworn in, President Carter starts that address by saying, before I say anything else, I want to stop and say thank you to outgoing President Gerald Ford for all he did to heal our land. This really sets the tone now for friendship and reconciliation to occur. So they went from, you can see what happens here, they start out never as enemies. President Ford and President Carter did not look at political opponents as enemies. They were opponents, but they were not enemies. They were Americans. There was more that united them than divided them. So President Ford basically, went from his attitude toward Jimmy Carter from being an opponent, a political opponent, to now a civic friend. Not a personal friend yet, but a civic friend.
During the interregnum between the election and the inauguration, Carter came and spent time at the White House with Ford. And Ford thought it was just going to be a courtesy call, but in fact, they spent 90 minutes talking about foreign policy.
Now, President Ford and President Carter are going to scrap and claw again in the 1980 election because President Ford is still a Republican and President Carter is now running for re-election. Ronald Reagan, though, is the guy who's going to win that election. And of course, President Ford wants to support the Republican and not the Democrat. But once they get through the campaign of 1980, President Reagan is now in office. An issue comes up when Anwar Sadat, is assassinated in October, the fall of 1981.
It's an occasion of more than ceremonial mourning for Ford and Carter. They both feel a real personal sense of loss. And Ronald Reagan, who was just recovering still from an assassination attempt that spring, there was no question of his going. And so in his stead, they sent the three living former presidents.
President Reagan makes available the plane to go over to carry Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter, three former presidents, all of whom had worked on Middle Eastern peace. And it was on that flight that Jimmy Carter and President Ford started to bond, to move beyond just being civic friends to now more of personal friends.
What is one of your favorite memories about Gerald Ford?
Well, I think the gentleness with which he ran against me. We never would have dreamed about having a negative television commercial, criticizing the other person. And after the election was over, we were on a reviewing stand together, and my first thing I said in my inaugural speech was, we want to express our deep, great gratefulness to Jerry Ford for healing our nation.
And following Carter's passing, the Ford Museum in Grand Rapids has a new exhibit honoring his memory and his unique friendship with President Ford. We got a look at that exhibit, speaking to the curator about the message behind it, and to one woman who, for her, being able to participate in it was a very special experience.
It was a tale of two presidents and a perhaps unexpected friendship.
Well, I think it was a really unique bond that they shared.
President Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, defeating Grand Rapids' own President Gerald Ford, a Republican, in the very close 1976 election. Nevertheless, the two fostered a very close relationship in the decades to come.
I think it really speaks to the character of both President Ford and President Carter, and this fact that they really did put the interests of their nation first.
And following the passing of former President Carter on Sunday at the age of 100, the caretakers of President Ford's legacy paying tribute to his longtime friend.
So at the Ford Museum, it was really important for us to be able to have a display honoring both President Carter's life and the friendship between Ford and Carter.
A new exhibit honoring Carter's life featuring pieces of his past, from campaign buttons to photographs spanning the length of their competitive race close and decades-long friendship to memorial books for the public to sign, set to be sent to the Carter Library in Atlanta.
When we heard that Jimmy Carter had passed, it was an emotional moment for me personally, because he was such a role model for me.
But another piece also awaits visitors like Linda Toth, a door from Habitat for Humanity to honor the Carter's longtime service to the organization. We found Toth, who told us she used to work with Habitat through a church group, signing not the face of the door with the rest of the signatures, but the wooden side beam.
And we would always, in those homes that we were helping to build, say, God bless your family, God bless your home, good luck in your home. Try to make it personal to the family, and we'd sign it on the wood so that the wood would then be covered up.
And for Carter, a man she and others across the country admired, Toth said this time was no different.
So we signed it here on the frame holding the door, God bless your new home, meaning a new home for Jimmy Carter to heaven.
And that's the rundown for your week in Michigan politics. Be sure to keep up with all the top political stories of the day, both on air and online at 13onyourside.com. We'll see you next week.